Welcome back everyone to another episode of the Frankenstein Reader's Guide, the series where I take a deep dive into all aspects of Mary Shelley's famous novel. In the last episode we looked at Victor Frankenstein, and in this video we're going to look at his creation, the creature. In many ways the creature is one of the most misunderstood figures in all of literature, both in his own story and in the public perception. We'll be looking at just how misunderstood he is in these ways in the first part of the video. We'll also be looking at whether the monster should be read as a tragic victim or ultimately as a villain. We'll also look at how Shelley portrays the ideas of her time, especially ideas to do with human nature versus nurture, and how she represents these through the moral development of the creature. And so we'll also be touching on how the creature develops his moral character and how Shelley ultimately shows that he is innocent and pure, at least in his natural state. Part 1. A misunderstood monster. One of the interesting things about the creature is that he's misunderstood not just within his novel, but also in popular culture. This is mainly due to the older film adaptations of Frankenstein, which tend to portray him in a way that is not really in line with his characterization in the books. This is most true of the 1931 Frankenstein film with Boris Karloff, where the monster isn't portrayed as evil per se, but he is portrayed as a mute, only able to grunt and moan. And also in the sequel to that film, The Bride of Frankenstein, where the creature is able to say a few words, but again, he can't really speak in the eloquent, rational way that we get in Mary Shelley's novel. This is also true of the 1957 film, The Curse of Frankenstein, where the creature is reduced to a destructive experiment that went wrong. In all of these cases then, Frankenstein is presented as dumb at best, and even if he's presented as good, or at least not inherently evil in these adaptations, he doesn't have the sophistication that he has in Shelley's novel. An interesting element of these films as well is that the creature's shortcomings are partly explained by the experiment going wrong in some way. In the Karloff film, Frankenstein's assistant Fritz damages the brain by accident, and this is also true of the 1957 film as well. This negates some of the moral power of the original novel in my view, because it implies that Victor's experiment is something that maybe would have gone perfectly right and everything would have been fine if not for human mistakes, which does weaken the message of the story, which is much deeper than that. It's much more about, should we be pursuing this experiment at all? And in the case of the novel, of course, the experiment does work. The monster that's created is in many ways just like a human child, and the way that he turns out has nothing to do with the inherent evilness of the experiment and to do with how the creature is created. So these changes that the films make really have led to the mischaracterization of Frankenstein's monster. It also takes away some of the moral culpability on Victor, who, as I argued in the last video, is a hard character to like because he's driven in many ways by selfishness, and he's really incapable of understanding why he is ultimately to blame for everything that went wrong in his life. Now, there have been some more faithful adaptations of the novel in recent years, but I do think that the older films still very much have captured the imagination. We've all seen those pictures of Frankenstein with the bolts in his neck. All of those images come from those classic films. And so it's not surprising then, if you haven't read the books, you might think, as I did when I read this book for the first time in school, that the monster is just evil and that the story is about Victor creating this monster, which is a terrible evil thing, and ultimately he has to destroy it. And that's actually not the story that we get. You also might think that the creature himself is called Frankenstein, because in some of the films he is. And most interestingly though, even when you read the novel for the first time, if you're not aware of the story itself, you might actually continue to misjudge the creature because of the way that Shelley structures her novel. The majority of Volume 1 is told from Victor's perspective, as he tells Walton about the creation of the monster and the deaths of William and Justine. And because Victor is a very compelling narrator, we take it for granted that the creature is responsible for these deaths, and we take it for granted that he was right to run away from the creature immediately. And so we assume throughout the whole part of Volume 1 that the monster is just out there to destroy Victor's life and his loved ones. It's only when we get to Volume 2 and the creature gets to tell his side of the story that we realise that Victor has made a mistake and misjudged the creature. Sadly, the creature's life can be summed up with him just being constantly rejected by humanity and misjudged by them. Because of his hideous appearance, he's constantly outcast by everyone he comes across, irrespective of his attempts to make peace with them. Although he spends a long time helping the de Lacy family and even tries to speak to their blind grandfather in order to make some headway there before he exposes himself to the people that can see him, the family reject him. When he leaves the family, he saves a woman from drowning, only to be shot at by her partner, and even when he approaches William, he's not doing that in the spirit of revenge. He thinks, looking at this child, that it will be an innocent child who hasn't imbibed the prejudices of society and is shocked to discover that actually even the child is afraid of him. And it's this overwhelming grief, really, at being rejected so much and by someone so innocent that leads the creature to claim his first victim. But one thing you might wonder is, if the monster is so hideous and terrible to look at, why didn't Victor realise this while he was working on the creature? Obviously he would have seen it before it woke up, so why is it something that he only realises at that moment of animation? I think we get a clue to why this is the case when Victor describes the creature coming to life. His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful. Great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost the same colour as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. So Victor tried to create this beautiful creature by selecting features, presumably from the corpses that he used, that he considered to be beautiful, with this lustrous black hair and pearly white teeth, but this contrasts in a terrible way with the deathly elements of the creature's appearance, with his watery eyes and straight black lips. There's a horrible contrast here between life and death that's revealed only when the creature comes to life. For Victor, when the creature is dead, the reason why he's not horrified by what he's looking at is because he's just looking at a corpse, and as a scientist working in this area, this is something that he's going to have seen. There's nothing especially uncanny about the way that a corpse looks. It's only bizarre if you think about the person, when they were alive, that it looks strange. But when this corpse comes to life, you then have this terrible juxtaposition between life and death, and that is what it is that I think terrifies Victor. That being said, I do think that Shelley is very careful in the way that she describes the creature, and in a way we get from this description of his appearance that, especially on a reread, once we know who the creature really is, we get a more sympathetic reading of this description rather than one that's of pure horror. The pearly white teeth suggest something that is precious, pure and beautiful, but more importantly, the watery eyes are the things that really capture your heart and make you think that the creature is ultimately destined for sadness. If his eyes are watery, it suggests that he's constantly on the verge of tears, and that does reflect his tragic fate. Unfortunately, neither Victor or anyone who comes across the creature notice the sadness in the creature's eyes. They just can't see past the horror of this living death. Part 2. The creature's identity. Werther, Paradise Lost, and Plutarch. The early parts of the creature's story find him behaving very much in the way that we would expect a newborn baby to act. He's overwhelmed by the sensations around him, and he doesn't really have a strong memory of these early experiences either. I said in episode 1 of the series that Shelley was inspired by Locke's tabula rasa theory of human nature, the idea that when we're born we have no innate ideas within us, and that these are things that come through experience. And this is certainly what we see unfolding with the monster. Arguably, some have said in a way that makes the story less believable, and I can sort of see why that's the case. The idea that the monster is just able to learn everything that it does through reading little bits of books that it finds and overhearing a woman being taught English is a little bit far-fetched, but I do think that it is a nice illustration in a sort of more artistic way of this theory developing. There are many things that go into the creature's moral development. Obviously, his rejection by human beings is one of the things that causes him to become incredibly hostile to them in the end. But more importantly, it's his connection to literature that really develops his moral character and his personality. And there's a part of the text where he describes coming across 3 books in particular that have a big influence on him. An interesting thing to note is that while 2 out of 3 of these books are actually fiction books, he calls them histories, which implies that for the creature, these are things that he can learn from. These are stories that actually happened, and so he's taking them a lot more literally than people usually do when it comes to their readings of stories. One of these books is Plutarch's Lives, sometimes called Parallel Lives. This is a text which contains 48 biographies of famous men written in Greek by the Greco-Roman philosopher, historian, and priest Plutarch, probably written at the beginning of the 2nd century. And the lives that are presented in the story are meant to represent various virtues and vices. This is the book that introduces the creature to various important moral and political principles. It's how he comes to understand virtues and vices and have the moral understanding that he does. He describes this book as inspiring him to a sense of idealism and to nobility. He also says that it makes him yearn to be good and virtuous like these great men in history. But of course it also sharpens his understanding of his own exclusion by society as well. As he can come to see what the vices of humanity are, he can see how those vices are reflected in those who are rejecting him. I learned from Plutarch's lives high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections to admire and love the heroes of past ages. So another important part of that description there is that it's a book that stops the creature from looking inward on himself and trying to see how he is connected to others in a moral sense. Although, of course, he'll ultimately reject this because with everyone rejecting him, he doesn't feel any strong moral connections towards others. Another of the key books that he reads is The Sorrows of Young Werther, written by Goethe. This was a romantic novel published in 1774, and it tells the story of Werther, who is a young romantic soul. He's in love with someone who doesn't reciprocate his love, and it's a very arguably self-indulgent book. It's very melodramatic, and it ends with Werther's suicide. In fact, the novel had such an emotional intensity for its time that it became associated with many Werther-inspired suicides. So I think Shelley was very astute in choosing this novel for the creature. The Sorrows of a Young Werther establishes in the creature a sense of emotional intensity of his situation, his loneliness, and his romantic despair. He relates to Werther as a fellow being who is excluded from the love of others. And of course, it only deepens his need for connection and understanding by others as well. If you've ever read or ever come to read Sorrows of Young Werther, you will definitely find a similar writing style there in the way that the creature talks and about his experiences. He comes across as a very Werther-inspired kind of creature. They both have this melodramatic way of talking, arguably a little bit self-indulgent as well at times. So you can certainly see how Shelley has been careful not just to select a novel that represents the creature symbolically, but also she is made sure to, when she's writing from the creature's perspective, show that he is really inspired by these texts. And that's one reason why I forgive the somewhat cumbersome way in which she develops her character's morality, because she does take a lot of effort to show these ideas really impacting the creature, and it comes out in the way that he speaks and interacts with others. The third text that the creature is inspired by is Milton's Paradise Lost, and this is arguably the one that he is most affected by, as he talks about it several times throughout the novel. Paradise Lost by Milton is a 17th century epic poem that retells the biblical story of the fall of man, Satan's rebellion, Adam and Eve's temptation by the serpent, and their expulsion from Eden. In terms of themes, this is definitely the book that is most relevant when it comes to understanding the creature and his fate in the story. And he himself notices the symbolic connections between him and the characters in this text. He relates, of course, to Adam, who is a creature that is rejected by his creator, and he also relates to Satan as well as the archetypal outcast. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, but I was wretched, helpless and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition. So you can see here that the creature is really connecting with Adam, but he's also noticing a little difference in that while Adam is created by this benevolent God, he has not been created by a benevolent God because his God has abandoned him from the start. And therefore we get this hint that he connects more with Satan, but even then he notices a big difference between himself and Satan. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. So in this way, the creature finds himself even more wretched than Satan, because Satan can find companionship with other devils, but the creature is truly alone. And this is obviously what motivates the creature to demand of Victor that he create a companion for him, because true suffering is loneliness. Part 3. Vengeful Monster or Tragic Victim. Although I do err very much on the side of sympathy when it comes to the creature, we can't deny that he does do some terrible things throughout the story. Murdering people is not right by any stretch, and doing so out of vengeance is wrong, especially when these people are ultimately innocents. Obviously, killing William is horrific because William is just a small child, but for me it's the framing of Justine that is truly horrible, and I want to juxtapose what the creature says about his motivations for committing these two crimes. I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with an exultation and hellish triumph. Clapping my hands, I exclaimed, I too can create desolation. My enemy is not invulnerable. This death will carry despair to him, and 1,000 other miseries shall torment and destroy him. So this is the creature talking about William's murder and his feelings as he commits the murder. And you can see that it's clearly an emotionally charged passage. At this point, he's been rejected by so many human beings, including William, and so he's really just in this moment acting out of that pure impulse of revenge and despair. But one thing that we should remember, as horrible as it often is to see children dying in fiction, as it is in real life, we should remember that in many ways the creature is also a child, And Shelley, as I said, she makes it quite clear that that's the case in the way that she describes the creature's first moments in life. And there is something right up to the end that remains quite childlike about the creature. Of course, we don't think of him in that way because he's so hideous and large and ugly, but he is in many ways a child to the world, and he is in many ways very innocent. So in some ways, it's more like a rejected child murdering a spoiled child in this scene. However, when he comes to framing Justine, the creature is a little bit more cruel and calculated in what he says. She was young and gentle and pretty, but I was bent on mischief. I remembered too well the treatment I had suffered from her protectors, and felt inflamed by pain. For the first time the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them, but allowing myself to be borne away by the stream, I bent over her and placed the portrait securely in one of the folds of her dress. So we can see here that the creature is very much more calculative in what he's doing, and he's projecting the rejection that others have put on him onto Justine. Justine hasn't rejected him in the way that William did or the way that other people did. He's just decided that she is going to be the scapegoat for his suffering, which is a horrible moment because he himself is a scapegoat for Victor's failings and also just for society in general. So it's quite cruel that he does the same thing here to Justine. He even seems to recognise her innocence by describing her appearance in the way that he does, and then immediately saying afterwards that he doesn't care because he was just bent on mischief at the moment. Although the creature does demonstrate remorse for his actions later in the novel, I think this is the moral turning point for him. This is the point of no return. Once he's decided to do this vengeful thing, he can't really stop his mission, and certainly doesn't stop his mission until the end of the story. Even if he does have moments of regret, like after he kills Henry, for example, he's always driven back to vengeance in the end. And to illustrate this, we should consider what the creature says about why he killed Henry and then why he killed Elizabeth. This comes from the very end of the story when he's talking to Walton, who has discovered him over the corpse of Victor. I pitied Frankenstein. My pity amounted to horror. I abhorred myself. But when I discovered that he, the author at once of my existence and of its unspeakable torments, dared to hope for happiness, that while he accumulated wretchedness and despair upon me, he sought his own enjoyment, in feelings and passions from the indulgence of which I was forever barred, then impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I recollected my threat and resolved that it should be accomplished. I knew that I was preparing myself for a deadly torture, but I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. So the monster is describing here the interim period between him killing Henry out of vengeance after Victor refuses to create a companion for the creature, and then his decision to murder Elizabeth. And it shows that really there's nothing he could do to stop being vengeful at this point, because if Victor ever saw enjoyment in his life, whether with Elizabeth or anyone else, the monster would just be driven to revenge again. He's now got that impulse in him, and so really he could never satisfy his vengeance. And so I think while it's fair to sympathise with the creature to some degree at why he's come this far, it's also important to bear in mind that at this point he really is illustrating this idea that vengeance is a bitter cycle that you can't really get off once you've begun it. In fact, we get a clue to this theme very early in the novel when Alphonse, Victor's father, is warning Victor against pursuing vengeance against William's killer. Come, Victor, not with brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Of course, one key distinction here between Victor and the creature is that the creature doesn't really have anyone that he can be soft with. He doesn't have a companion. And so in many ways, he's sort of forced into this path of vengeance, which is definitely one of the key themes of the creature, the way that it's his expulsion that leads him to wretchedness and then leads him to vengeance. And so it's this that makes me sympathise a lot more with the creature, because at least according to the morality of the novel, you know, in order to be good, you need to be connected to your fellow human beings. Victor is led astray, not because people exclude him, but because he excludes himself, pursuing mindless ambition. Whereas the creature wants to connect with other human beings and be a good person, but he's constantly rejected and outcast by everyone, so that he can never really become a truly compassionate being, because there's no one who cares about him. He's just an outcast. Part 5. The innocence and goodness of the creature. And so just to continue to push this point about the creature's goodness, I want to talk about some of the ways that Shelley subtly communicates the creature's goodness, at least his innate goodness. Obviously he doesn't end up being very good, by the end of the story, but he certainly is at heart, I think, a good creature that just wants to be loved. One of these things is that the creature appears to be naturally a herbivore. My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. So this subtly suggests that the creature is not by nature a killer, and so any of the killings that it does through the story are not things that come to it by nature. Completely the opposite of what Victor assumes about the creature, because he just assumes initially that the creature is just hell-bent on killing people. I also think that Shelley was very deliberate there in choosing the words kid and lamb to reflect the creatures that human beings kill. Kids and lambs are baby animals, and so there's that further addition to innocence there. The creature doesn't harm innocent, pure things, but Victor does. The experiments that he does, we don't know much about that. It's not implied that he kills anyone, but he's certainly, desecrating the bodies and corpses of people in the pursuit of his mad ambition. And of course, human beings also do have to kill in order to survive. And again, I think there's also a nice irony here in that, given that the creature is biologically not one for killing things, Victor is so wrong in his assumptions about the nature of the creature as a cruel killer. In fact, the only time the creature does kill any animal is when he's killing creatures for Victor. At the end of the story, when Victor is pursuing the creature, Victor writes that the creature is leaving him behind all of these horrible clues and murdering people and doing all of these terrible things. And it's implied, I think, that the creature has not done this in subtle ways. And at one point, we do get this passage that tells us that Victor is being left food, but Victor doesn't think that the creature is doing this. Sometimes when nature, overcome by hunger, sank under the exhaustion, a repast was prepared for me in the desert that restored and inspirited me. The fare was, indeed, coarse, such as the peasants of the country ate, but I will not doubt that it was set there by the spirits that I had invoked to aid me. We get a hint that the monster is the one doing this later in the story, when the creature leaves Victor the following note. You will find near this place, if you follow not too tardily, a dead hare. Eat and be refreshed. Come on, my enemy. We have yet to wrestle for our lives. It's a shame that Victor is unable to connect the dots. Again, he assumes that it's his supernatural invoking of spirits that is helping him and not the creature. And of course, the creature is ultimately wanting Victor to follow him because he wants this pursuit to continue. But nevertheless, the fact that the creature does this shows that he does have some care and concern for Victor, which Victor does not reciprocate in the slightest. And a final point that I want to make here is that when you think about it, every single death that the creature causes in the novel is ultimately connected to Victor in some way. Either they are the relatives or friends of Victor, and they're done in order to get back at him, or he's killing animals in order to feed Victor. So there's nothing self-serving in what the creature is doing, in the sense that he's not just killing people for the sake of it, he's doing it all because he wants, to have his revenge on Victor and to express his despair at his fate. He doesn't kill anyone outside of these people, and so again it kind of passes the buck, in my view, all back to Victor as the cause for all of this death. And the creature, while he does have a tragic fate and becomes a tragic villain by the end, lost in all of this vengeance, I think it's important to remember that Shelley really does give us a lot to suggest that in his natural state, the creature was an innocent, and it's ultimately Victor's rejection of the creature that leads to his madness and vengeance. Part 6, Conclusion. So in this video, we've looked at the various facets of the creature. We looked at how he's been misunderstood, not just as a creature within his own story, as he's misunderstood by everyone, including his creator, but how he's also been misunderstood in the popular imagination due to some very unsympathetic portrayals of him as either outright vicious or just kind of innocent, but ultimately quite stupid. What we get in the novel is a morally complex being, and we also see Mary Shelley illustrating this idea that human beings are by nature good-hearted, innocent and pure, and it's only society that corrupts them. We looked at whether we should interpret the monster as a villain in the story, and I argued against this. I think that in many ways the creature is a victim of Victor's abandonment, and while he does end up becoming a tragic villain, I think it's very important that we ultimately sympathise with the creature, given his constant rejection and his constant attempts throughout the story to always try to appease others and to make those connections. And given that he tries so hard to do this after so much rejection, it's no wonder he ends up where he does. But those are just my views though. Perhaps you disagree. I'd like to hear any other interpretations of the creature down in the comments. And if you have any questions about this video, this episode and the creature, let me know in the comments and I'll respond to those in the bonus video for this series. In the next video, we'll be looking at 3 other important characters in the story: Justine, Elizabeth and Henry. But until then, take care everyone. Ta-ra.